was the summer of 2014 when Daesh rolled into Mosul. After a lightning offensive, the group seized the city, taking weapons and millions of dollars in cash to fund and expand its so-called caliphate. Mosul became Daesh's main stronghold in Iraq. But in October last year, Iraqi forces prepared to take the city back. Kurdish Peshmerga fighters defended their ground in the north, while Iraqi forces advanced from the south and the east. By January this year, Iraqi troops reclaimed all of eastern Mosul, which stops at the Tigris River dividing the city. With the help of U.S. warplanes, they cut off Daesh by bombing 4 bridges, buying the army some time to prepare for the next offensive to take over the west. Iraqi counterterrorism units have been on the move since Sunday. Backed by jets, helicopters, and U.S. coalition forces, they're taking surrounding villages from Daesh. Some units have now reached Mosul's southern edge.
This is the gate to Mosul. Mosul is nearby, about 2 kilometers. We will soon enter Mosul, God willing.
But the main offensive will have to be on foot. Western Mosul is densely populated with old and narrow streets. And more than 750,000 civilians are believed to be trapped inside.
Security forces were able to protect hundreds of thousands of civilians in eastern Mosul. 550,000 civilians stayed in their homes. Their intention is to use a similar humanitarian concept of operations in western Mosul as long as it's effective.
For Iraqi forces, the battle ahead will be daunting. But they sense victory and are pushing ahead. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Iraq analyst Ali Al-Mawlawi in Baghdad. He's the head of research at the Al-Bayan Center for Planning and Studies. And from Tunis, Zaid Al-Ali. He's a former Iraq advisor to the United Nations. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Ali Al-Mawlawi, let's begin with you. The Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, said, "It's a new dawn, a dawn of victories." Isn't this a bit premature, given that Daesh can still put up quite a fight in the west and the south of Mosul?
Well, I think it's important not to be complacent, but given the successes over the past 4 months in the eastern part of Mosul, I think it's good to be optimistic. Of course, ISIS has had 2.5 years to prepare for this battle. So, of course, Iraqi security forces should be prepared for a lot of tricks and surprises that they may face going forward.
Zaid, major worries over civilians and whether they can be looked after, whether they can be helped on their way out. And these are hundreds of thousands of people. The UN and others are concerned. But beyond that as well, whether they can avoid being tortured or even slaughtered, because we saw horrible things happen to them after Fallujah was retaken by Shia militias and the Iraqi government and so on. How confident are you that civilians won't bear the brunt of the suffering if and when Mosul is retaken?
What I would say is, civilians in Mosul are obviously in the middle of a war zone. So there's no question that they're going to be suffering and that they won't be in very good circumstances, regardless of how careful security forces are. There are many civilians will be killed, many will be injured. There's absolutely no avoiding it. It's going to happen. The question is whether any of the suffering, killing, and wounding will be taking place deliberately at the hands of Iraqi security forces. And despite what we've seen happen in other parts of Iraq and in other circumstances, it looks that so far, by and large, broadly, security forces that are taking place in the battle to liberate Mosul have been acting very professionally and have not been engaging in any deliberate repression of the local population. Having said that, the major problem that we have in Mosul, as is the case elsewhere, is that the security services in the country are very much splintered. There isn't a single security sector or single service that's responsible for doing all of the liberating or all of the fighting or all of the peacekeeping after the fighting is over. You have one unit which is called the Counterterrorism Service, which is doing a lot of the frontline battle battling, and they're doing a very fine job and they're very professional. But after they move on, territories afterwards taken over by other groups and other units, and their level of professionalism can often be very mixed. Sometimes it's very high, sometimes it's not. And therefore the concern is the behavior of those groups after they take over from the counterterrorism service, and the types of behavior that they'll be engaging in.
And Ali, the US is providing air cover to all of these groups, but the Iraqi army and, of course, those other groups. Now, how encouraged are you by the fact that General Mattis has said, hey, we're not in Iraq to take the oil, contradicting what his boss had said a bit earlier, and that the US is committed to providing air cover to these operations to try to root out Daesh? How encouraged are you by that?
Well, I think the coordination has improved drastically over the past year. Iraqi forces are relying in large part on air cover from the international coalition. So I'd expect that level of coverage to continue going forward into this new administration. I think there are still many challenges, logistical challenges to fix. And of course, going forward, once the city is retaken, there is an enormous security challenge of ensuring that law and order is established and really rooting out the final remnants of ISIS. There is a danger, of course, of sleeper cells that may remain in the city. And for that reason, I think the role of the Iraqi army is perhaps to secure the borders of the city, but there is an important role for the local police and also local leaders, local politicians, to ensure that the city remains stable going forward.
And Zaid, final question for you. If Daesh is routed in Mosul, as many people hope and expect, and then onward to Raqqa in Syria, they're taken out there, is there, unfortunately, the horrible twist to that we might expect more terrorism in many towns and cities outside of Iraq and Syria as they lash out?
That will probably happen, but it's what will definitely happen is more terrorism inside Iraq. Obviously, terrorism outside of Iraq and in Europe and Turkey and elsewhere hasn't been good, but it's really Iraq that's borne the brunt of the terrorist activities that we're talking about. Iraq has had the most sustained, violent, and brutal terrorist campaign waged against it in the whole history of mankind. You're talking about the equivalent of 1 September 11th every month since 2003. So it's been 14 years of sustained terrorist activity in Iraq. So, while we can expect that there might be more terrorism activity outside of the Middle East, it's really Iraqis who will be bearing the brunt of this. And the lesson for Iraq has to be that the proper way to engage with this is a more professional security service that is capable of investigating crimes and distinguishing terrorists from non-terrorists.
Good point. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap. Zaid and Ali, thanks so much for joining us.